right, the next most basic component are scales. So what is a scale? Basically, if you understand what we've talked about so far, that you have 12 tones or 12 notes in the base of, that's all the notes that you have. You have 12 tones to work with from C to C again, and that is called the chromatic scale. Everything between C and C, there are 12 tones that are the chromatic scale. Now that's the most basic structure that you have to work with that we've already spoken on. Now how do you make other scales from that? Well, other scales are going to be set notes and with set intervals at set step distances that stay that way to form different scales from those 12 tones. So you are picking certain notes out of the chromatic scale with a root tone. The basis of the scale, you have to start with a root tone. It could be C or D or E or D sharp. Any note will be the root of that scale. And then you will have chosen notes that go along with that are part of the chromatic scale, part of the 12 tones. And that is going to be what is entailed in making your scale. So that is the basic concept of what a scale is. So what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about how scales are built. Okay, the first part of it are intervals, and I'm going to try to make this as simple a concept for you to get a hold of as I can. You're dealing with what we've spoken with so far. So you've got between C and C. What are their intervals? Well, it's pretty simple. That, you know, if you look at it that way and try to keep it that simple in your mind, that D is the second interval, E is the third interval, F is the fourth interval, G is the fifth interval, A is the sixth interval, B is the seventh interval. Okay, so you understand that number because there's 7 tones in that scale. And most music is based on that interval structure. No matter what scale you're dealing with that you want to look at it this way, the intervals of the actual keyboard, depending on what scale, that the intervals used on that scale may be different, but what the intervals are remain the same. So you'd have this note here that's that D flat, that's a flat second interval because this is the second interval. So this E flat or D sharp, that's going to be a flat third, a minor third interval. The fourth interval, the fifth interval, you've got the minor fifth there. It's a minor fifth interval. And then you've got like the sixth interval, it's a minor sixth interval. You got the seventh interval, the one below it, it's going to be a minor seventh interval. And try to keep those intervals and what that is very simple in your mind. And understand that that can change depending on what note you start with. If you start with B and go to B, that those intervals are going to be the same distance. So, you know, you've got a whole step here. You know, we've talked about whole steps, half steps. You got a half step, 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 back to C. Whole step would be 2 of those. Half step equals a whole step. So depending on what root note you start for your scale, that those intervals are going to be the same, and you have half steps and whole steps that separate the notes. And so those two really super basic concepts, if you can just understand that those are huge basic structures for you to understand scales and understand those intervals and what that means. You know, that's the first interval, second interval, third interval, fourth interval, and you understand the structure of it. That's basically dealing with it from a major scale point of view is its whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, back to C. Now those intervals aren't really going to change. No matter what scale you're really looking at, that this from the root of C to this minor third interval, because this is the third interval, that no matter what scale you're playing, or no matter how if you're playing C minor isn't going to matter, whether you're playing C minor scale or a C major scale, because this is still the minor third interval from the root of C. So from that root to that interval is a third. It's a major third interval. And to D, it's a second. To F, it's a fourth. To G, it's a fifth. That's the distance from the root to whatever note you're dealing with. And depending on what root you start with, those intervals are going to be the same distance. Does that make sense? So all you have to do is just remember the counting of it between those 12 tones, and remember the intervals we just talked about, and remember the whole steps and half steps. And that's the basic components for constructing any scale. Let's go over that one more time just to make sure you're on the same wavelength. Okay, from C to C, and you could have, this is the root of the scale, any scale you're dealing with. You want to look at those intervals from the 12 tones from a major scale. The major scale goes whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. And the reason why that is, and why you're basing it off that major scale, is so no matter what scale you're working with, the scale you might be working with might go C, D, F, F sharp, A, C. I mean, that scale might be built that way. But that's not going to really matter what that interval is, because this E is still the third interval from C, no matter what scale you're dealing with. And so this note here is going to be a minor third. This is the second interval, so this is going to be a minor second interval. This is the fifth interval, so this is going to be a minor fifth interval. And so that it's real basic in your mind that way. Because if you're going from B, it's going to be first interval, second interval, third interval, and that distance still the same. So this D would be the minor third interval. And I hope I made that very simple so that that concept of those whole steps, half steps, and intervals, so that no matter what scale, you've got a scale that goes C, E, F, F sharp. What is F sharp in that scale? If C is the root, then F sharp is obviously a minor fifth interval, correct? And it's gonna the interval distance is the same no matter what root you start with. That way you always know whether you're dealing with a major third or a minor third or a fourth or a minor fifth or a sixth or a minor sixth or a seventh or a minor seventh. That interval structure and the whole steps, half steps are set together like that, just like that, so that you can understand whenever you're working with a scale what the interval components are. And you'll understand why later when you're making major and minor scales or major and minor harmonies and things like that. But just keep that in mind. Remember that. Root of the scale, whole step, whole step, whole half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, back to C. And those are going to set your intervals, because this is always going to be a fourth. Even if you don't use that fourth in with the scale you're working on, F is always going to remain in the fourth interval. Even if you're using the F sharp in the scale and not an F, that it's going to be a minor fifth interval no matter what the scale is that you're looking at. So I hope I made that real simple and real clear so that you can remember that and understand those intervals and how they're set up that way to build scales and understanding which intervals are in the scales and the steps distance from them, whole steps or half steps. All right, the next thing you want to understand is what is the step distance from your intervals. That way when you're building a scale or you're thinking about a scale that's going to be played from the root of A, how many whole steps from there is there? So that you understand that a major second interval is a whole step. A major third interval is 2 whole steps from the root. A major fourth is going to be 2 whole steps and a half step. A major fifth is going to be 2 whole steps, a half step, and a whole step. Does that make sense? That way that when you're looking at that and you're looking at the minor fifth interval, that you know how many half steps and whole steps are away from it. A whole step, whole step, whole step. It's 2 or 3 whole steps from the root tone that is that minor fifth. And that can be complicated, but that simple basic understanding of understanding, how many steps away. And it can go backwards also. So if you're looking at from C down, this is a second interval from C down. Or you're going down to a third, A would be a minor third down from C. Does that make sense? Because it's whole step and then a whole step or half step, and then a whole step is going to be a minor third, because you got a whole step and then a half step is the same as the whole step and the half step going up. So it's a minor third down rather than a minor third up. Now that concept, I hope I made that really clear and as simple as I could, so that you don't sit around a lot of time sitting trying to understand intervals and, you know, whole steps and half steps that are the basic building blocks of scales. So I hope that was real simple. Like I said, in any of these videos, if that's not clear enough, you can always ask me, but that's the basic structure components to build the scales. And next, we're going to talk about some scales and how they're put together.